In 1976, an elderly woman named Mary died on a sheep farm in Oxfordshire, England. She had no title, no fortune, no public identity. Her husband was a former waiter, 26 years her junior. Her ashes would later be placed on top of his casket in a churchyard in the Orkney Islands, about as far from civilization as the English-speaking world allows. Her real name was Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt. She had been born in the largest private residence in North America. But 134 years before Cornelia vanished into the English countryside, another heiress made the same impossible choice, and the consequences shook the Pennsylvania state legislature to its foundations. This is not a love story. This is a story about what happens when love collides with architecture. Not the architecture of stone and mortar, but the architecture of money, trusts, legislative acts, social registers, marriage contracts, the invisible walls that wealthy families build, not to keep the world out, but to keep their children in. 2 women, 2 centuries. One question: can you own a fortune, or does the fortune own you? Chapter 1: The Richest Girl West of the Allegheny Mountains. Before Mary Croghan turned 16, her grandfather's empire made her the wealthiest unmarried woman between New York and the Mississippi River. To understand how a teenage girl became a financial weapon, you have to go back to the founding of the fortune. Her grandfather was Colonel James O'Hara, an Irishman who arrived in the American colonies just in time to pick the winning side. He served as a quartermaster during the Revolutionary War, and supplying Washington's armies with everything from gunpowder to salt beef. When the war ended, O'Hara did what every clever quartermaster does. He kept his connections, and he kept his eye on land. Pittsburgh in the 1790s was not a city. It was a frontier outpost, a muddy triangle where 3 rivers met, smelling of coal smoke and animal hides. The population barely topped 1,000, but O'Hara saw what others missed. He saw a crossroads. Every settler heading west, every barge carrying goods down the Ohio, every merchant trading with the interior had to pass through Pittsburgh. O'Hara bought land, then he bought more: glassworks, breweries, ironworks, salt mines in the Kanawha Valley, a stake in the town's first bank. He built the first glassworks west of the Alleghenies and operated one of the largest breweries in the region. By the time he died in 1819, James O'Hara owned more of Pittsburgh than any single person ever had or ever would again. His holdings included hundreds of city lots, commercial buildings along the waterfront, mineral rights extending across multiple counties, and interests in at least a dozen operating businesses. He was, by any measure, the founding plutocrat of Western Pennsylvania. The fortune passed to his daughter, Mary Carson O'Hara, who married William Croghan Jr., a gentleman from a prominent Kentucky family, whose own relatives had distinguished themselves in frontier warfare and politics. The Croghans settled into a 22-room Greek Revival mansion on a hill overlooking the Allegheny River. They had servants, carriages, and a social position that placed them at the absolute summit of Western Pennsylvania society. The mansion was a monument to the O'Hara fortune: polished floors, crystal chandeliers, and a library stocked with volumes imported from London and Paris. But the marriage was brief. Mary Carson O'Hara Croghan died when her only daughter was still a small child. The girl was named Mary Elizabeth Croghan. Little Mary grew up in that 22-room mansion with a father who adored her and a fortune that terrified everyone around her. Colonel William Croghan was a kind man by all accounts, a widower who never remarried, a father who poured the full weight of his affection onto his only child. He dressed her in the finest clothes. he hired tutors. He took her to church each Sunday and introduced her to every respectable family in the region. But he was also a practical man. He understood what his daughter was. She was not just a girl. She was the sole vessel for the O'Hara estate, a fortune so vast that it included, by some estimates, nearly a third of the developable land in the city of Pittsburgh. In modern terms, adjusted for inflation, the O'Hara-Croghan holdings would be worth approximately $1.5 billion. The land alone covered hundreds of acres that would become the commercial heart of a major American city. The rents generated enough income to sustain a family for generations. All of it was heading, by right of inheritance, directly into the hands of one girl. And in Jacksonian America, where coverture law meant that everything a woman owned became her husband's property the moment she married, that girl was the most valuable prize west of the Allegheny Mountains. Colonel Croghan knew this. Every fortune hunter in 3 states knew it too. They came calling. Young men with polished boots and rehearsed smiles, presenting letters of introduction and asking to be received. The colonel turned them away. He was polite about it. He was firm. And so, the colonel did what any loving, frightened father would do. He sent Mary away to boarding school on Staten Island, 300 miles from Pittsburgh, 300 miles from every ambitious young man who saw his daughter and saw a balance sheet. The school was run by a clergyman named Reverend Charles Anthon, and it catered to the daughters of the Eastern elite. Mary would receive a proper education. She would be sheltered from the fortune hunters. She would be safe. He thought distance would keep her safe. He was wrong. Chapter 2: The Invisible Empire Behind Every Grand House. In 1881, 1.6 million British women woke before dawn to scrub, dress, and feed people who were trained never to see them. That number, drawn from the British census, represents the largest single category of female employment in the Victorian world. 1 in every 3 working women in Britain was a domestic servant. In America, the numbers were comparable, and the architecture of the great houses was designed, from foundation to rooftop, to maintain one illusion: that the comfort surrounding the wealthy appeared by magic. Consider the hidden staircases. In the great mansions of the Gilded Age, and the Vanderbilt houses on Fifth Avenue, the Astor Estate at Ferncliff, the Belmont Chateau in Newport, the architects built 2 complete circulation systems. The grand staircase, wide and carpeted, with mahogany banisters and stained glass windows, was for the family. The service staircase, narrow and uncarpeted, hidden behind baize doors, was for the people who made the house run. A footman carrying coal for the bedroom fireplaces at 5 in the morning was never to be seen by the family. A lady's maid helping her mistress dress would enter through one door and vanish through another. The corridors were designed so that the 2 populations, the served and the servers, could move through the same building without ever crossing paths. The bells were the nervous system of this invisible empire. In every room in the house had a pull cord or a button connected to a system of wires and bells mounted on a board in the servants' hall. The board showed which room was calling. The butler monitored the board. The appropriate servant responded. No one knocked on the kitchen door to ask for tea. One pulled a cord. The tea appeared. The mechanism was hidden. The labor was hidden. Only the result was visible. This was not simply a matter of convenience. It was ideology. The gap between those who served and those who were served was the foundational social fact of the 19th century Anglo-American world. And it was policed with a rigor that would make a military commander proud. Servants who became too familiar with the family were dismissed. Footmen who spoke without being addressed were fined. Maids who were found in the family rooms outside their working hours were turned out without references. A servant who forgot her place was not merely reprimanded, she was erased. The marriage market operated on the same principle of invisible boundaries, but at a much higher altitude. For the daughters of wealthy American families, marriage was not a private matter. It was a financial transaction negotiated between families, governed by lawyers, and designed to consolidate or expand dynastic holdings. The so-called 400, the list of families deemed acceptable by Mrs. Astor's social arbiter, Ward McAllister, functioned as a membership roll for the marriage pool. If your family was not on the list, your sons and daughters were not eligible candidates. Between 1870 and 1914, 454 American heiresses married European aristocrats in what historians would later call the dollar princess phenomenon. The brides brought cash. The grooms brought titles. The contracts were explicit. Consuelo Vanderbilt's marriage to the Duke of Marlborough in 1895 came with a dowry of $2.5 million in railroad stock. The Duke got the money. Consuelo got Blenheim Palace. Neither got much happiness. The marriage was famously miserable, and Consuelo would later describe it as a prison sentence she endured for the sake of her family's social ambitions. This was the system. The marriage market was a market. The social register was a membership list. The servant class was invisible. And the one line that could never, under any circumstances, to be crossed was the line between those who served and those who were served. A duke could marry an heiress. An heiress could marry a banker. A banker's daughter could marry a senator's son. But no one, absolutely no one, married the help. Which is precisely what made the events at Mary Croghan's boarding school so explosive. Because the man who caught her eye was not a duke. He was not a banker. He was a soldier, yes. But he was also a man of uncertain means, nearly 3 times her age, and working within the walls of her school. The walls of class were about to be breached, and the system would respond with everything it had. Chapter 3. A schoolgirl, a soldier, and a ship to Liverpool. Captain Edward Wyndham. Harrington Shenley had survived the Battle of Waterloo, buried 2 wives, and freed enslaved Africans in South America before he met a 15-year-old girl at her boarding school. That sentence contains everything that makes this man impossible to categorize. He was not a villain. He was not a saint. He was, like most people at the center of a scandal, complicated. Edward Shenley was born in England around 1799, though the exact date remains uncertain. He received a commission in the British Army as a young man and served at Waterloo in 1815, where he witnessed the carnage that ended Napoleon's empire. The battle lasted a single day and killed roughly 47,000 men. Shenley survived it. He carried the memory for the rest of his life. He married his first wife, a woman from a respectable English family, and had children. She died. He married again. His second wife also came from means. She also died. By his early 40s, Shenley was a twice-widowed veteran with children, a modest military pension, and a restless conscience. The conscience matters. Before arriving in America, Shenley served in British Guiana and was involved in efforts to suppress the illegal slave trade along the South American coast. The British had abolished the slave trade in 1807, but enforcement was uneven. and ships carrying captured Africans still cross the Atlantic with grim regularity. Accounts from the period suggest Shenley personally participated in the liberation of captured Africans from slave ships. This was not a man driven solely by self-interest. He had risked his comfort and possibly his career for a moral cause that many of his peers considered beneath their attention. But none of that mattered when he arrived at the Reverend Charles Anthon School for Young Ladies on Staten Island. What mattered was this: he was 43 years old, and Mary Croghan was 15. The precise nature of his role at the school is debated. Some accounts describe him as a language tutor. Others suggest he was a military instructor of some kind, teaching deportment or riding to the young ladies. What is not debated is the result. Mary Croghan, the richest girl west of the Alleghenies, fell in love with a man who was older than her father. We will never know exactly how it happened. No diary survives. No letter describes the courtship. The walls of the boarding school were supposed to keep the students safe from the world, but walls work both ways. They also trap. Mary was 15, motherless, raised by a father who loved her, but kept her at a distance of 300 miles, surrounded by other wealthy girls whose futures had already been negotiated by their families. She was lonely in the particular way that only the very rich and very young can be lonely. She had everything except the one thing she wanted: someone who saw her, not her fortune. And here was this man, scarred and worldly, old enough to be her father, a veteran of the most famous battle in European history, a man who had crossed oceans and buried wives and fought against the slave trade, a man who carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had faced death and come out the other side. He was not handsome. He was interesting. And for a 15-year-old girl trapped in a gilded boarding school, interesting was irresistible. What we know is that in the spring of 1842, Mary Croghan and Captain Edward Shenley eloped. They did not elope to a justice of the peace in New Jersey. They eloped to a ship bound for Liverpool. Try to hold the image. A 15-year-old girl raised in a 22-room mansion, educated at the finest boarding school in New York, heir to a fortune worth a third of Pittsburgh, standing on the deck of a transatlantic vessel, watching the American coastline disappear behind a curtain of Atlantic fog. Beside her stands a man nearly 3 decades her senior, a man with battle scars and dead wives and a reputation that will be destroyed the moment word reaches shore. This was not a whim. Crossing the Atlantic in 1842 took 3 to 4 weeks. It required planning, secrecy, and money. Shenley had arranged the passage. Mary had packed her things and slipped away from the school without alerting the Reverend Anthon. They had made a decision, and they had committed to it completely. The ambition of love itself was at its zenith. Mary believed that love was enough, that her fortune, her family, her city, and her country could be left behind, that she and Edward could build a life in England, free from the machinery of dynastic expectation. She was about to discover how wrong she was, because back in Pittsburgh, her father had received the news, and he did not simply weep. He fainted. Then he stood up, dried his eyes, and declared war. Chapter 4. Her father fainted. Then he called the legislature. Colonel William Croghan did not simply threaten to disinherit his daughter. He persuaded an entire state government to do it for him. The news of Mary's elopement reached Pittsburgh like a cannonball through a cathedral window. The colonel collapsed. Friends and relatives rushed to the Croghan mansion on the hill. Ministers were summoned. Lawyers were summoned. the household descended into something between grief and military mobilization. By the time the colonel recovered his composure, the machinery of revenge was already in motion. First came the attempt to stop the ship. Croghan used every connection he possessed, political, military, personal, to petition the federal government to intercept the vessel carrying his daughter to England. He wrote to congressmen. He appealed to naval authorities. The request was denied. The ship was already in international waters. Mary was gone. Then came the pulpits. Pittsburgh's clergy, many of whom had dined at the Croghan table and benefited from O'Hara family generosity for decades, denounced Mary from their Sunday platforms. She was called a fallen woman, a disgrace to her family, a warning to other young women about the dangers of disobedience and foreign seduction. The sermons traveled from church to church, from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia to New York. The Reverend Anthon's school, where the elopement had been plotted under his roof, was destroyed by scandal. Families pulled their daughters out within weeks. The school closed its doors and never reopened. A man's career and livelihood, collateral damage in the war Colonel Croghan was waging against his own child. But Colonel Croghan was not finished. Sermons were satisfying. Public shame was useful. What he wanted was structural. He wanted to ensure that Captain Shenley, the man he regarded as a predator and a fortune hunter, would never touch a single dollar of the O'Hara estate. And for that, he needed something more powerful than a preacher. He needed the law. In 1842, the Pennsylvania state legislature passed an extraordinary act. It was extraordinary because it was personal. This was not a general law governing inheritance or marriage. This was a law written about one specific girl, one specific marriage, one specific fortune. The act placed the entire O'Hara-Croghan fortune, every acre of Pittsburgh land, every share in every company, every dollar in every bank account, under the control of court-appointed trustees. The trustees were given authority to manage the estate at their discretion. Mary would receive an allowance, determined not by her needs, but by the trustees' judgment. Captain Shenley would receive nothing. To understand why this was possible and why it was considered necessary, you need to understand coverture. Under coverture law, which governed marriage in every American state in 1842, a woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's at the moment of marriage. She could not own property in her own name. She could not sign contracts. She could not sue or be sued. She could not keep her own wages. Every asset she brought into the marriage became, automatically and completely, her husband's property. The legal term was feme covert, a covered woman, covered by her husband's legal identity, erased by her own wedding vows. Colonel Croghan understood coverture perfectly. He knew that the moment Mary said, "I do," on that ship, every acre of Pittsburgh real estate that bore the O'Hara name became, in the eyes of the law, the property of Captain Edward Shenley. A twice-widowed British soldier of modest means would suddenly control one of the largest private fortunes in America. The land that James O'Hara had spent decades accumulating, the glassworks and breweries and ironworks that represented a lifetime of ambition, all of it would pass into the hands of a foreign soldier who had no connection to Pittsburgh, no loyalty to the O'Hara legacy, and no obligation to preserve any of it. The legislative act was Croghan's counterattack. It created a legal barrier between Mary's inheritance and her husband. The trustees, not Mary, would control the money. The trustees, not Captain Shenley, indeed would decide how it was spent. The effect was a cage built of statute. Mary was still the heir, but the inheritance would be held at arm's length, managed by men her father trusted, dispersed only as those men saw fit. This was not unprecedented. Wealthy families had used trusts to protect fortunes from reckless heirs for centuries. English aristocrats had perfected the practice with strict settlements and entails designed to keep estates intact across generations. But the specificity of this act was breathtaking. The Pennsylvania legislature had been convinced to pass a law targeting one teenager, one girl, one marriage. The entire apparatus of state government, the committees, the floor debates, the votes, the governor's signature had been mobilized because a 15-year-old fell in love with the wrong man. The scale of the response tells you the scale of what was at stake. This was not a family squabble played out in parlor rooms. This was a fortune worth, in today's money, approximately $1.5 billion. The land alone covered hundreds of acres of what would become downtown Pittsburgh, Oakland, and the surrounding neighborhoods. The rents, the mineral rights, the commercial leases generated income that could fund a dynasty for generations. And all of it was threatened by one girl's decision to board a ship. Think of it in military terms, as this story demands. Colonel Croghan deployed every weapon available to him. He used social pressure through the churches, turning the clergy into his artillery. He used political connections to attempt federal intervention, calling in favors from congressmen and naval officers. He used the legal system to build a trust structure that would survive his own death. And he used the legislature itself, the sovereign power of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, as a battering ram against his own daughter's marriage. A father's love transformed into institutional vengeance. That is the phrase that captures this moment. Because Croghan was not a cruel man. Every account of his life before the elopement describes a devoted, even tender father. He did not punish Mary because he hated her. He punished her because the logic of dynasty demanded it. The money must not leave the architecture. The fortune must not pass into foreign hands. The system must be preserved, even if preserving it meant destroying the one person it was built to protect. The lock on the golden cage had been turned. Mary was an exile, and she was about to discover just how cold that exile could be. Chapter 5. Letters from Exile that no one answered. 7 months after her elopement, Mary Shenley wrote the most heartbreaking letter in Pittsburgh's archives, and her father refused to reply. The letter is dated September 1842. It survives in the Darlington Autograph Collection at the University of Pittsburgh, a fragile sheet of paper crossed with the handwriting of a teenager who is trying very hard to sound like an adult and failing. The ink has faded, but the words remain. Mary wrote to her father from England. She wrote with the formal diction of a girl trained in a finishing school. But the emotion underneath the formality is unmistakable. She begged him to forgive her. She told him that her love for Captain Shenley was genuine and that she had entered the marriage with open eyes and a willing heart. She asked him to believe that she had not been deceived or coerced, that the decision to elope had been hers as much as Edward's. She acknowledged that she had caused him pain, and she asked, with a directness that cuts through nearly 2 centuries of distance, for him to write back. Just a letter, just a word, just some sign that the father who had loved her for 15 years had not stopped. He did not write back. Captain Shenley also wrote. His letter, preserved in the same collection, takes a different tone. Where Mary pleaded, Shenley apologized. He addressed Colonel Croghan with military formality, man to man, acknowledging the impropriety of the match, defending his intentions, and requesting a meeting to discuss the family's future. He noted his service record. He mentioned his previous marriages to women of standing. He was careful not to beg. The letter is measured, dignified, and almost certainly futile. Shenley must have known, even as he dipped his pen, that Croghan would not answer. The silence that followed was not accidental. It was strategic. Croghan's refusal to respond was itself a weapon. In the social code of the 19th century, silence from a patriarch was a verdict. It meant the offender was dead to the family. No letter, no meeting, no acknowledgement, no negotiation. The girl who had been the center of her father's world was, by his own deliberate choice, erased from it. And the exile deepened. Captain Shenley was still a British officer, technically subject to orders from the War Office. Shortly after the elopement, the British authorities, possibly under pressure from Croghan's American connections, or simply as a convenient way to dispose of an embarrassing officer, reassigned Shenley to British Guiana. This was not a promotion. British Guiana in the 1840s was a malarial colony on the northern coast of South America, a posting given to officers the Army wanted to forget. The heat was murderous. The fever was constant. European wives who accompanied their husbands to the colony died with distressing regularity. Lord Palmerston himself reportedly signed the order. Imagine Mary, 16 years old, married to a man who loves her but cannot provide for her in the style she was raised, separated from her father, her home, her country, her fortune, sent to a tropical colony where the air itself seemed to carry death. She had traded a 22-room mansion on a hill in Pittsburgh for a wooden house in a swamp in South America. She had traded crystal chandeliers for mosquito nets. This is the point where the fortune hunter narrative collapses under its own weight. If Captain Shenley had married Mary for her money, British Guiana would have been the end of the story. He had no access to her fortune. The trustees in Pittsburgh controlled everything. He was living on his officer's salary, supporting a teenage wife in one of the most dangerous postings in the British Empire. A fortune hunter would have abandoned her, would have filed for separation, would have negotiated a settlement and sailed back to England. Shenley did not. He stayed. He endured. He held his wife's hand through the fevers and the loneliness and the silence from Pittsburgh. They survived Guiana. They returned to England. But England was no paradise. Victorian society operated on the same invisible hierarchies that governed America, and word had crossed the Atlantic faster than any ship. The elopement, the age difference, the father's denunciation, the legislative act, all of it had preceded the Shenleys to London. Doors that should have opened for the wife of a Waterloo veteran stayed shut. Drawing rooms that would normally welcome a woman of Mary's fortune were closed. Invitations did not arrive. The most important door of all, the door to the royal court, was bolted. Queen Victoria would not receive Mary Shenley. In the social economy of Victorian England, being received at court was not merely a privilege, but it was a credential. Without it, a woman of Mary's supposed standing could not attend the best parties, could not be presented to the right people, could not occupy the social position that her birth should have guaranteed. The Queen's refusal was not personal. Victoria almost certainly never thought about Mary Croghan Shenley for more than a passing moment. But the refusal had the effect of a second exile. Mary was shut out of American society by her father, and shut out of English society by the Queen. She was 17 years old, exiled twice over. And the father who had caused it all would not even answer her letters. The years in England were not all darkness. Mary and Edward built a life. They had children. They created a household that, if not grand, was functional and loving. Shenley's military connections, though strained by the scandal, were not entirely severed. They found allies among the liberal circles of London society, people who cared less about the circumstances of a marriage than about the character of the people in it. Slowly, painfully, they carved out a place for themselves. But the absence of her father haunted everything. Mary had not run away from Colonel Croghan. She had run toward Edward Shenley. The distinction mattered to her, even if it did not matter to the world. She had not rejected her father. She had simply loved someone he could not accept. And the punishment for that love, the silence, the exile, the legislative act, was wildly disproportionate to the offense. She was a teenage girl who had married an older man. She was not a criminal. She was not a traitor. She was a daughter who wanted to be forgiven. The letters in the Darlington collection do not tell us everything. They do not tell us what Mary said to Edward at night when the rain beat against the windows of their London house. They do not tell us whether she ever regretted her choice. They do not tell us if she cried when the post arrived and there was nothing from Pittsburgh. But they tell us something more important. They tell us that a 15-year-old girl, stripped of her fortune, her family, and her country, wrote to the man who had done the stripping and asked him, with heartbreaking politeness, to love her again. And he refused. Chapter 6. The lock on the golden cage finally turns. It took 8 years, a house in London, a replicated ballroom in Pittsburgh, and the death of a broken father before Mary Shenley saw a penny of her inheritance. The reconciliation happened slowly, like a siege ending not with a white flag, but with the gradual exhaustion of both sides, like two armies who have run out of ammunition and simply stop firing one morning without a treaty. The first crack appeared around 1845, 3 years after the elopement. Colonel Croghan, aging and increasingly unwell, made the journey to England. He did not announce his arrival with fanfare. He did not send word ahead. He simply appeared. The accounts suggest that the meeting was emotional but restrained. A Victorian father did not weep in public. He did not embrace his daughter in the street. He assessed. What he found, apparently, surprised him. Mary was not living in squalor. She was not miserable. She was not the broken, desperate girl he may have imagined during 3 years of self-imposed silence. She was married to a man who treated her well, who had endured exile and hardship without complaint, and who had not, despite every temptation and every legal avenue available to him, attempted to access the Croghan fortune through the courts. Captain Shenley had not sued. He had not petitioned the Pennsylvania judiciary to overturn the legislative act. He had not hired lawyers to challenge the trustees. He had simply lived on his salary and supported his wife. Croghan began to soften. The first gesture was practical. He purchased a house in London for the couple. Not a grand house by Mayfair standards, but a respectable one. A house with a proper address and enough rooms for a growing family. Enough to signal that the exile was easing. He also arranged for a living allowance to be paid from the estate, a monthly sum that gave Mary a measure of financial independence without overturning the legislative act. Then came the gesture that broke hearts in 2 cities. Back in Pittsburgh, Colonel Croghan ordered an addition to Picnic House, the family's rural retreat outside the city. The addition was a ballroom, and it was not just any ballroom. Croghan instructed his architects to replicate, as closely as possible, the dimensions and style of the London house he had purchased for Mary. A ballroom in Pennsylvania, built to look like a drawing room in England. A room designed so that a father who was too proud to say he was sorry could stand in Pittsburgh and feel, for a moment, that he was standing beside his daughter. The symbolism is almost too painful to bear. This was a man who had marshaled the full power of the state government to punish his child, who had used the legislature, the churches, and the courts to build a wall between Mary and her inheritance, who had maintained years of silence so complete that his daughter's letters went unanswered. And now he was building a room shaped like forgiveness, a room shaped like regret, a room that said everything his letters never did. Colonel William Croghan died in 1850. He was roughly 68 years old. He had spent the last 8 years of his life navigating between the love he felt for his daughter and the institutional machinery he had built to control her. The machinery outlasted him, but so did the love. In the end, neither won. The father who built the cage and the father who built the ballroom were the same man, and he died before he could finish being either one. Upon his death, the legal situation shifted dramatically. The trustees who had managed the estate during Croghan's lifetime now faced a new reality. Mary was no longer a teenage runaway. She was a grown woman in her mid-20s, a mother of several children, a wife of nearly a decade. Captain Shenley had proven, through years of patience, that he was not the fortune hunter the colonel had feared. The legislative act was still technically in force, but the political will to enforce it with the same zeal had died with the colonel. Over the following years, through a series of legal proceedings and negotiations with the trustees, Mary Shenley gained full control of her inheritance. The exact mechanics are buried in court records and lawyers' correspondence, but the outcome is clear. By the mid-1850s, Mary Elizabeth Croghan Shenley was one of the wealthiest women in the United States. The O'Hara lands were hers, the rents were hers, the commercial properties, the mineral rights, the bank shares, all of it was hers. And Pittsburgh, the city that had watched her father destroy her reputation from pulpits and legislative chambers, now watched her return as its richest citizen. The irony was total. The city that had denounced her now depended on her. The fortune that legislators had locked away from her was now unlocked and larger than ever. The girl they called a fallen woman now held the deeds to their streets. The fortune that had been weaponized against her was now in her hands, and what she did with it would define Pittsburgh for the next century and a half. But the point of no return in this chapter is not legal, it is emotional. The moment that matters most is not the moment Mary received her inheritance. It is the moment we realize that Colonel Croghan spent the last 8 years of his life destroying his relationship with the only person he loved, and that by the time he found the courage to rebuild it, he was out of time. He died with the ballroom finished. He died without ever dancing in it with his daughter. Chapter 7. The Girl Who Was Born Inside a Castle. On the morning of her 21st birthday, 250 servants and tenants gathered at dawn to celebrate the woman who would one day abandon every single one of them. The year was 1921. The place was Biltmore Estate near Asheville, North Carolina, and the woman at the center of the celebration was Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, the only child of George Washington Vanderbilt and Edith Stuyvesant Dresser. If Mary Croghan's story is about the machinery of punishment, Cornelia's story is about the machinery of suffocation. Different gears, same cage. The lock is identical, only the key is different. Biltmore was not a house, it was a statement. George Vanderbilt had commissioned it in 1889 from the architect Richard Morris Hunt, the same man who designed the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty and the facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Hunt had built mansions for the Vanderbilts before, including the famous Marble House in Newport. But Biltmore was something else entirely. It was an attempt to transplant a French Renaissance chateau into the mountains of western North Carolina. The construction took 6 years and employed roughly 1,000 workers at its peak. Special rail lines were built just to deliver materials to the site. The finished estate comprised 250 rooms, including 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, and 65 fireplaces. There was a bowling alley, an indoor swimming pool, and a banquet hall with a 70-foot ceiling. The grounds covered 86,000 acres of western North Carolina forest, landscaped by Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who designed Central Park. Olmsted planted millions of trees. He built miles of carriage roads. He designed the approach road so that visitors would catch their first glimpse of the house through a gap in the trees, a moment of calculated awe. The total cost of construction was approximately $6 million in 1895 money. Adjusted for inflation, that figure approaches $200 million today. It remains the largest privately owned house in North America. Cornelia was born inside this monument in 1900. Her father died when she was 14. George Vanderbilt, who had built Biltmore as a retreat for scholarly contemplation and scientific forestry, never saw his daughter grow up. Her mother, Edith, a formidable woman with a steel will and a gift for management, took over the estate and ran it with the efficiency of a small government. Edith opened portions of the grounds to the public during the First World War. She managed the dairy farm. She oversaw the forestry operations that George had established with Gifford Pinchot, the future governor of Pennsylvania and father of American conservation. She maintained the house as a functioning social institution, hosting guests and managing a staff that numbered in the hundreds. Cornelia grew up surrounded by luxury so extreme that it became invisible to her. The 250 servants and tenants who gathered at her 21st birthday celebration were not decorations. They were the population of a small village, and they depended on the Vanderbilt family for their livelihoods. Footmen, maids, cooks, gardeners, foresters, dairy workers, stable hands, carriage drivers, laundresses. Each one had a role in the machinery that kept Biltmore running, and each one looked to the Vanderbilt family for their survival. She was, by all accounts, a spirited young woman. Photographs from the period show her riding horses, attending parties, and smiling with a confidence that came from never having been denied anything. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. She was striking, tall, with strong features and an air of determination that photographs still convey across 100 years. In 1924, Cornelia married the Honorable John Francis Amherst Cecil. He was the son of Lord William Cecil, a direct descendant of the Marquess of Exeter and a member of one of the oldest noble families in England. The Cecils had served English monarchs for 400 years. They had built Hatfield House. They had held titles, lands, and political offices across centuries. John Cecil brought lineage that even the Vanderbilts could not match. What he did not bring was fortune. The Cecil family had prestige, but not American-scale wealth. It was, in many ways, a classic dollar princess arrangement, though by the 1920s, the phenomenon had largely run its course. The wedding at All Souls Cathedral in Asheville was the social event of the year. Thousands of people lined the streets. The couple received gifts from across the country. The Vanderbilt name still carried weight, and the marriage of its last American heiress to a British aristocrat was front-page news from Carolina to California. Photographers captured Cornelia in white, smiling beside her husband, framed by the arches of the cathedral. She looked, in those photographs, like a woman who had everything the world could offer. This was the peak, the absolute zenith of the Vanderbilt architecture in Asheville. Cornelia was 24 years old, married to a titled Englishman, living in the largest private home in North America. Everything the dynasty had built stood polished and gleaming around her. Everything that followed was descent. Chapter 8. Pink Hair and the Slow Vanishing of a Vanderbilt. When Cornelia Vanderbilt dyed her hair pink and declared it was her proper color aura, the servants at Biltmore knew the marriage was already over. The early years of the Cecil marriage were conventional enough. Cornelia and John had two sons, George Henry Vanderbilt Cecil, born in 1925, and William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil, born in 1928. John took over the management of the estate from Edith, who was aging and ready to step back from the daily burdens of running a 250-room house. He ran Biltmore with the quiet competence of a British aristocrat who understood that land was a responsibility, not merely an asset. And that was the problem. John Cecil loved Biltmore. He loved the land. He loved the dairy. He loved the forestry operations. He loved the management, the meetings with tenants, the slow rhythm of agricultural life. He was, in many ways, the perfect steward for the estate. But Cornelia was not looking for a steward. She was looking for a life. The boredom set in gradually, like damp rising through stone. Cornelia had been raised in a castle, but she had also been raised in the 1920s. She had tasted the energy of New York during visits. She had met artists, writers, musicians. She had experienced the intoxication of a world that valued creativity and rebellion over lineage and obligation. At Asheville, for all the beauty of the Blue Ridge Mountains, was not Greenwich Village. And Biltmore, for all its grandeur, was a monument to someone else's vision. Her father had built it. Her mother had maintained it. Her husband now managed it. What was left for Cornelia? She began to drift. First to New York, where she rented an apartment in Greenwich Village and began moving in bohemian circles that would have horrified her mother. She attended art openings. She met painters and sculptors and writers who did not care about the Vanderbilt name, except as a curiosity, a relic from an older America. The pink hair was the visible sign of an invisible transformation. Cornelia embraced spiritualism, alternative lifestyles, theosophy, and color therapy. She declared that pink was her proper aura color and dyed her hair accordingly. For a woman in the 1930s, this was radical enough. For a Vanderbilt, it was an earthquake. In the staid world of Asheville high society, a society that still defined itself by the estate on the hill, a Vanderbilt with pink hair was not merely eccentric. It was a declaration of war against everything the family name represented. The marriage deteriorated in parallel. Cornelia and John separated, though the divorce would not come until 1934. The grounds cited in the proceedings were carefully neutral. The reality was simpler. Cornelia had met the man who would accelerate her departure from the Vanderbilt world entirely. His name was Guy Bear. He was a Swiss artist, a sculptor and painter who moved in the European artistic circles that Cornelia found increasingly magnetic. He was not wealthy. He was not titled. He was not, by the standards of the world Cornelia had been born into, anyone at all. But he was alive in a way that John Cecil, for all his virtues, was not. Bear looked at the world and wanted to make something from it. Cecil looked at the world and wanted to manage it. For Cornelia, the difference was fatal. The divorce proceedings played out against the backdrop of the Depression. Biltmore itself was struggling. The vast estate that had once employed hundreds was contracting. The fortune that had built it was diminished by the crash of '29. The Vanderbilt wealth, spread across too many heirs and too many mansions, was not what it had been. In 1930, in a move that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier, the Cecils opened Biltmore to the public as a paid attraction, charging $2 per visitor. The private chateau became a tourist destination. The family home became a business, and Cornelia chose him. In 1934, Cornelia Vanderbilt left America. She went to Europe with Guy Bear, leaving behind her 2 sons, her mother, and the 250-room house where she had been born. She left behind the dairy farm and the forestry operations and the wisteria that bloomed each spring along the estate's pergola. She left behind the servants who had gathered at dawn on her 21st birthday. She left behind the name that had opened every door in the country. She did not look back. Contrast this with Mary Shenley's story, where Mary was punished by external forces, by a father, a legislature, a queen. Cornelia's departure was internal. No one passed a law to strip Cornelia of her inheritance. No minister denounced her from a pulpit. No father collapsed in grief and then marched to the state capitol. The crack that broke the Vanderbilt architecture in Asheville was not a legislature. It was emptiness. Mary Shenley fought the system and was eventually readmitted. Cornelia did something more radical. She did not fight the system. She simply walked away from it. And when a Vanderbilt walks away from Biltmore, the silence she leaves behind is louder than any legislative act. Chapter 9. The Heiress Who Chose a Waiter and Became Mary. By the time Cornelia Vanderbilt married William Goodsir in 1972, she had already erased her own name, her country, and every trace of the dynasty that made her. The decades between Cornelia's departure from America and her final marriage read like a deliberate program of self-erasure. Each year, each decision, each relationship moved her further from the world she was born into and deeper into anonymity. It was not a collapse, it was a project. The marriage to Guy Bear was the first step. They lived in Europe through the late 1930s and the war years, moving between France, Switzerland, and England. The relationship did not last. Bear faded into the same obscurity that Cornelia was courting. The details of their separation are sparse, deliberately so. Cornelia was already learning to keep her life out of the papers. Cornelia's second marriage took her further from the spotlight. She settled in England and began building a life that had nothing to do with Biltmore, nothing to do with the Vanderbilt name, nothing to do with the world of 250 room houses and 86,000-acre estates. She changed social circles. She stopped attending the kinds of events where a Vanderbilt would be recognized. She became, in the eyes of anyone who did not know her history, an ordinary Englishwoman living a quiet life in the countryside. And then she met William Goodsir. Goodsir was a waiter, not a former waiter who had moved into business, not a waiter at the Ritz with aristocratic connections, a waiter. He was also 26 years her junior. When they married in 1972, Cornelia was 72 years old and Goodsir was 46. The great-granddaughter of the Commodore, the girl who had been born in a 250-room chateau, the woman whose 21st birthday had been celebrated by 250 servants gathering at dawn, married a man who served food for a living. This was not a scandal. Scandals require an audience, and Cornelia had spent nearly 40 years making sure she had none. No newspaper covered the wedding. No society columnist commented on the match. The Vanderbilt family, to the extent that they were aware of it at all, said nothing publicly. Around this time, Cornelia did something that reveals the depth of her transformation. She began calling herself Mary, not Cornelia, not Mrs. Cecil, not Mrs. Bear, not even Mrs. Goodsir. Mary, a common name, an unremarkable name, a name that belonged to no dynasty and carried no weight and triggered no recognition in any social register in the English-speaking world. Think about what that means. She did not merely leave Biltmore. She did not merely leave America. She did not merely leave the Vanderbilt family. She left herself. The woman named Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, heir to one of the greatest fortunes in American history, ceased to exist, not through death, but through choice. She performed a kind of social suicide, killing the public person while the private person continued living under a different name, in a different country, in a different world entirely. The name Mary is significant. It was the name of the other heiress in this story, Mary Croghan Shenley, who fought the system and won. Whether Cornelia knew Mary Shenley's story is unknown. Whether the choice of name was deliberate or coincidental is something we will never be able to confirm. But the parallel is haunting. Both women bore the weight of dynastic fortune. Both chose love over architecture. And both ended their stories as women named Mary. She and William Goodsir settled on a sheep farm in Oxfordshire. The farm was modest. The life was rural. The daily rhythm was not of servants and guest lists and telegrams from New York, but of feed schedules, lambing seasons, and muddy boots by the kitchen door. The woman who had once commanded 250 employees now tended animals with her own hands. Cornelia Vanderbilt, who called herself Mary, who married a waiter, who raised sheep in Oxfordshire, died in 1976. She was 76 years old. The death was not front-page news. It was barely reported at all, a brief notice in the local paper. Nothing in the New York Times, nothing in the Asheville Citizen. The Vanderbilt dynasty did not issue a statement. Her ashes were placed on top of William Goodsir's casket in a churchyard in the Orkney Islands. The Orkney Islands sit off the northern tip of Scotland, battered by Atlantic winds, closer to Norway than to London, closer to the Arctic Circle than to North Carolina. It is about as far from Biltmore Estate, from Fifth Avenue, from the Vanderbilt name, as it is possible to travel within the English-speaking world. This was not an accident. Cornelia did not end up in the Orkneys by chance or by circumstance. She chose it. She chose the farthest point, the most remote churchyard, the most complete disappearance. The woman who had been born at the center of American wealth chose to be buried at the edge of the world. Mary Shenley fought the golden cage and eventually broke free. Cornelia Vanderbilt looked at the golden cage, decided it was not worth fighting, and simply vanished. Both women proved the same thing. The architecture of inherited wealth was designed to hold them. One survived inside it. The other survived by making sure no one could ever find her again. Chapter 10. 300 Acres of Guilt and Gratitude. every person who has ever walked through Shenley Park is walking on the conscience of a family that tried to erase its own daughter. Mary Shenley did not merely survive her exile, she triumphed over it, and then she gave the triumph away. By the 1890s, Mary had been in full control of her fortune for decades. She lived primarily in England with Captain Shenley, managing her Pittsburgh holdings through agents, attorneys, and the occasional transatlantic visit. And the estate was enormous and growing. The O'Hara lands had only increased in value as Pittsburgh transformed from a frontier town into the industrial capital of American steel production. The city's population had exploded. The rents, the mineral rights, the commercial leases poured wealth into the Shenley coffers at a rate that would have staggered even Colonel James O'Hara. In 1889, the city of Pittsburgh asked Mary for a donation. They wanted land for a public park, a green space in the rapidly industrializing East End. What they received stunned them. Mary Shenley donated 300 acres of prime real estate for what would become Shenley Park. 300 acres. In the heart of a city where land values were climbing every year. But she was not finished. She donated the land on which the Carnegie Institute was built, giving Andrew Carnegie himself the foundation for his cultural monument. She donated the Fort Pitt Blockhouse, the oldest structure in Pittsburgh, and a relic of the French and Indian War, to the Daughters of the American Revolution. She funded fountains, she supported schools, she contributed to civic improvements that touched nearly every corner of the city. 425 acres of parkland in total, schools and libraries and cultural institutions that served tens of thousands, streets, bridges, and tunnels that bore her name. The woman who had been stripped of her inheritance by an act of the Pennsylvania legislature became the most generous benefactor the state had ever known. There is a word for what Mary did, and it is not charity. It is restitution, and not restitution for her own sins, because she had committed none beyond the crime of falling in love at 15. Restitution for the sins of the system, the fortune that had been used to cage her, to exile her, to silence her, was transformed into public good. The money that had been the instrument of her suffering became the instrument of an entire city's flourishing. Consider the arithmetic of conscience. The Legislative Act of 1842 cost Mary 8 years of exile, the love of her father during his final decade, the social standing that was her birthright, and the companionship of her own country during the years she should have been building a life. The 300-acre donation alone, at Pittsburgh land values in 1889, represented a gift worth millions of dollars. The total value of her lifetime giving to the city would be difficult to calculate, but it dwarfs the cost of what was taken from her. She gave back more than the system stole. Captain Shenley died in 1878. Mary survived him by 25 years. She spent those years managing her fortune with the same determination she had shown in surviving exile. The girl who had been judged too young and too foolish to control her own money proved to be one of the most capable stewards of wealth in American history. Mary Shenley died in 1903 in London at the age of 77. Her estate was valued at approximately $50 million, a figure that would exceed $1.5 billion today. She had outlived her father, her husband, and most of the men who had conspired to keep her fortune out of her hands. She left behind a city that could not exist in its present form without her generosity, and a story that the city has never quite known how to tell. The golden cage had held her, but she had gilded the world with what she found inside it. Chapter 11. A Million Visitors and One Missing Portrait. More than 1 million tourists walk through Biltmore every year, and almost none of them know that the woman who was born there died as a farmer's wife named Mary. Biltmore today is a brand. It is a tourist attraction that charges between $70 and $100 per ticket. It has a winery that produces more than 100,000 cases per year. It has a hotel, the Inn on Biltmore Estate, that charges several $100s per night. It has a collection of restaurants, a gift shop, an outdoor adventure center, and a Vanderbilt branded product line. The estate is managed by the Cecil family, Cornelia's sons George and William and their descendants, and it generates revenue that would have astonished even George Vanderbilt, a man who built the house as a private retreat for reading and forestry, not as a theme park. More than 1.4 million visitors pass through the estate each year. They admire the tapestries. They gaze at the Renoir paintings and the Sargent portraits. They marvel at the 10,000-volume library. They walk through the gardens that Olmsted designed and photograph the wisteria that still blooms each spring. They eat in the dining hall where the Vanderbilts once entertained presidents and senators and Astors and Rockefellers. What they do not see is Cornelia. The official Biltmore narrative handles Cornelia with the delicacy of a museum handling a forgery it would rather not acknowledge. She is mentioned. Her childhood is referenced. Her wedding photographs are displayed behind glass. But the pink hair is not discussed. Guy Bear is not mentioned. William Goodsir does not appear on any placard or timeline. The sheep farm in Oxfordshire, the adopted name Mary, the ashes in the Orkney Islands, none of it makes it into the audio tour or the printed brochures. This is not accidental. Biltmore is a business, and every business has a story it tells its customers. The Biltmore story is the story of the visionary Vanderbilt who built an American chateau, the devoted wife who preserved it, and the noble descendants who opened it to the public out of generosity and civic duty. Cornelia's story, the story of the woman who was born inside the castle and chose to die as an unknown farmer's wife, does not fit that narrative. It challenges it. It suggests that the most spectacular house in America was not enough to hold its own daughter. Cornelia established what some records call the Mrs. Smith and Mount Trust, a legal arrangement that further distanced her from the Vanderbilt identity and the Biltmore estate. She donated objects from her European life to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, placing her belongings in a public institution an ocean away from Asheville. She built a legacy that was deliberately, almost aggressively, separate from everything her father had created. The million tourists who visit each year are walking through a version of the Vanderbilt story that has been carefully edited. The missing chapter is Cornelia. The missing portrait is the woman with pink hair who married a waiter and chose sheep over servants. But perhaps that is exactly what Cornelia wanted. She spent the last 40 years of her life ensuring that no one would connect the farmer's wife in Oxfordshire with the heiress in Asheville. The fact that Biltmore erased her from its public story might be the one thing the estate did that Cornelia would have approved of. She wanted to disappear. And she did. The contrast between the two legacies is the visual and thematic spine of this entire story. Mary Shenley's name is written across the geography of Pittsburgh. It appears on parks, streets, bridges, schools, and fountains. She is remembered as a benefactor, a civic hero, a woman who took a vast fortune and shared it with a city. Cornelia Vanderbilt's name appears on a birth certificate in Asheville and a death record in Oxfordshire. And in between, she did everything in her power to make sure it appeared nowhere else. One woman used her fortune to build a monument, The other used her anonymity to become invisible. Both chose freedom. They simply defined it differently. Chapter 12. The Lock Still Works. The Married Women's Property Acts dismantled coverture, but the golden cage was rebuilt with newer, stronger wire. When Mississippi passed the first Married Women's Property Act in 1839, it was a crack in a wall that had stood for centuries. New York followed in 1848, passing a landmark statute that allowed married women to hold property in their own names for the first time. State by state, across the second half of the 19th century, the legal doctrine of coverture was dismantled. By 1900, married women in most American states could own property, sign contracts, keep their wages, and control their own finances. Mary Shenley's story was one of the forces that made this change necessary. The spectacle of a state legislature passing a law to strip a teenage girl of her inheritance, specifically because marriage would transfer that inheritance to her husband under coverture, illustrated the absurdity and cruelty of the old system with a clarity that no abstract legal argument could match. Mary's case did not single-handedly change the law, but it was one of the stories that made the injustice impossible to ignore. But the end of coverture did not end the golden cage. It simply modernized it. The tools changed. Where Colonel Croghan used a legislative act, modern dynasties use spendthrift trusts. These trusts, now standard in estate planning for families with fortunes exceeding $10 million, place assets beyond the reach of beneficiaries and their creditors, spouses, and former spouses. The beneficiary receives distributions at the discretion of the trustee. The beneficiary cannot sell, pledge, or assign their interest in the trust. The money is there. The beneficiary can see it. They can feel its weight shaping their life, but they cannot touch it without permission from someone else. Sound familiar? The Pennsylvania Act of 1842 placed Mary's fortune under the control of trustees who managed it at their discretion. The modern spendthrift trust does exactly the same thing, except now it is considered standard practice rather than extraordinary punishment. What was once an outrage has become a product. Estate planning attorneys charge tens of thousands of dollars to build structures that Colonel Croghan improvised out of grief and fury. Conditional bequests add another layer. A grandfather leaves $50 million to a grandchild, but only if the grandchild marries within the faith, or only if they complete a college degree, or only if they do not marry before the age of 25, or only if they sign a prenuptial agreement approved by the family office. The conditions vary. The principle does not. The money comes with strings. The strings are designed to control behavior across generations, reaching from beyond the grave to shape decisions that have not yet been made. Family offices manage the architecture. These private financial institutions, employed by families with fortunes exceeding $100 million, exist for one purpose: to ensure that the wealth survives. They hire the lawyers who draft the trusts. They employ the accountants who manage the taxes. They retain the investigators who vet the romantic partners of the next generation. They commission the prenuptial agreements. They monitor the spending. They report to the patriarch or the board. They are, in every meaningful sense, the modern equivalent of Colonel Croghan's legislative allies, the Pittsburgh ministers, and the Pennsylvania trustees, all combined into a single institution. And prenuptial agreements formalize the walls. Before a wealthy heir can marry, the family office produces a document. The document specifies what happens to the money if the marriage fails. It identifies which assets are marital and which are separate. It creates in advance the legal boundaries that Colonel Croghan had to improvise through a special act of the legislature. What took a colonel months of political maneuvering now takes a lawyer a weekend. The machinery has evolved. It is quieter now. It does not require public legislative sessions or denunciations from pulpits. It operates through lawyers' offices and family meetings and trust documents filed in Delaware and South Dakota and the Cayman Islands. But the function is identical. The money must not leave the architecture. Can you own a fortune, or does the fortune own you? Mary Shenley answered, by returning to the system and giving it away. 300 acres of parkland, libraries and schools and civic institutions. She took the fortune that had imprisoned her and turned it into the public inheritance of an entire city. She did not escape the golden cage. She filled it with gifts and left the door open behind her. Cornelia Vanderbilt answered by disappearing. She did not fight the system. She did not reform it. She did not give it away. She simply refused to be part of it. She changed her name. She married a waiter. She raised sheep. She placed her ashes as far from Biltmore as geography allowed, in a windswept churchyard in the Orkney Islands, where the Atlantic meets the North Sea and the nearest Vanderbilt mansion is 3,000 miles away. Both answers confirm the same truth. The architecture of inherited wealth was designed to outlast any individual who challenged it. And it has. The trusts are more sophisticated now. The family offices are more powerful. The prenuptial agreements are longer and more detailed. The surveillance is digital. The walls are invisible. But the cage has been remodeled, renovated, and reinforced across 2 centuries, and it still stands. It is still the same cage. The lock is still golden, and it still works. 2 women, separated by a century, asked the same question. One answered with generosity, the other answered with silence. And somewhere tonight, in a family office in Manhattan, or a trust lawyer's conference room in Wilmington, someone is building the cage again. The wire is newer. The lock is digital. But the question has not changed. Can you own a fortune? Or does the fortune own you? The ashes in the Orkney churchyard know the answer. The parkland in Pittsburgh knows it too.